Hello there, youngins. So by now, you should have finished reading chapter 20 in Rourke, which covers the 1890s. And the 1890s are a rather interesting period. There are a number of competing themes going on in this time, and it's kind of hard to lump all of them under one common uh, theme. You got the populist movement. You've got all the stuff going on with like the farmers' alliances. You have the labor movement and the labor wars. You've also got American imperialism and the Spanish-American War. So you've got a lot of things happening in this period that are kind of hard to classify under one overarching umbrella. So that makes examining the 1890s a rather interesting period in U.S. history. And it still remains one of the most tense periods of United States history. So to begin with, on the one hand, you start to see a backlash to the rampant inequality of the Gilded Age. And you see this take place in a variety of arenas. Notably, one of the earliest areas where there was at least some success at trying to address the inequalities of the Gilded Age was in agriculture and through the formation of the farmers alliances. So throughout the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, agriculture especially took a big hit. Or rather, I guess to be more specific, farmers took a pretty big economic hit. Not because there were any agricultural difficulties, far from it, but because of the way the Gilded Age economy worked and government economic policies during the Gilded Age, farmers really suffered a lot during this period. Because farm output remained steady and crop yields were high, crop prices were pretty low. On top of this, you have economic policies like land speculation, where a lot of the best land in the West was owned by what are referred to as absentee owners. They're owned by people who don't live there. And they're either rented out to farmers or they're owned by speculators who are just using the land to wait for the price of land to go up and then sell it at a profit. Yeah. What's really interesting about this period in time is that most of the land was already purchased either by speculators or by these farmers, and the land that was still available to be purchased was too expensive and out of reach for the average person, which really kind of ran counter to the way the West was settled following the Civil War through policies like the Homestead Act, where you had really cheap land prices, and the West did kind of provide a potential economic opportunity for people to go out and kind of make their own destiny. By the time of the 1890s and the late Gilded Age, that West no longer exists. It's bought up, and most independent farmers of the period were were struggling to get by. They didn't even own the land they were farming, they were renting it, or they were deeply, deeply in debt. And that kind of brings us to the next economic policy that was causing problem. You have the gold standard. So when we say the economy was on the gold standard, what that means is that throughout most of U.S. history, the official currency of the country was gold. However, in order to make it easier for people to actually have a reliable and effective currency on their person without having to lug around like gold coins, paper money was printed and minted. But it was redeemable in banks for gold. So let's say you had $100 in paper. If you did not want paper money, you could take that $100 to a bank and say, I want $100 worth of gold, and you get that much gold. Now, the gold standard had, it was really, really good for bankers and financiers and the upper classes, the people who already had money, because what the gold standard did was it effectively restricted the money supply. So the value of your dollar or the value of your money was not going to go down. So again, the bankers and the financiers really liked the gold standard because they were the ones who, they were the creditors. They were the people who other people owed money to. And you would want the value of money to stay high, so that way you're not effectively losing out by lending money to people. However, given the economic difficulties of the period, a lot of farmers were pretty heavily in debt. And farmers were being really hurt by the gold standard because it made it hard for them to get enough money to effectively pay off their debts. Added onto the situation, you had the railroad monopolies that, through their discriminatory shipping rates, put a high strain on small, independent farmers who were not able to get discounts or rebates for shipping large, bulk quantities of goods, and also they were also hurt because they were not shipping their crops long distance. So they weren't getting long haul rebates as well that larger corporate farmers or corporate farms were getting. So to try and address these problems, you have the formation of farming cooperatives, where basically all the farmers in an area would get together to try and find ways to address foreclosure and declining crop prices. Most notably by joining together and refusing to sell their crop until the prices rose. So that way none of them would be losing money and they would all be able to cover their costs and pay their mortgages and not get their farms foreclosed upon. In other instances where farms were being foreclosed and sold at auction, farming cooperatives also served to kind of protect farmers from totally losing their land because, and we'll see similar measures taken during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl to prevent foreclosures on farms, where when the farm was being sold at auction, their neighbors would effectively put in to buy it at a cheap price and then sell it back to the guy who lost it for a really low price, for something like $1. So, but the whole point of the farming cooperative, it's kind of almost like a labor union for farmers, where they're all in it together and they're trying to use their collective power to overcome the institutional and problems that they were facing from the government and from big business. These farming cooperatives gave rise to organizations collectively termed as the Farmers Alliance, which were organizations that formed to advocate for agricultural interests. So the Farmers Alliances basically took this notion of the farming cooperative and politicized it, where they basically said, hey, instead of trying to, protect us from the effects of the problem, why don't we turn our efforts towards grassroots lobbying to try and fix the problem and get rid of it? And this gives rise to the most successful third party in American history, the People's Party, also known as the Populist Party. So, as you may know, the United States, the American political system is kind of unique amongst industrial democracies in that the U.S. is a two-party system. There are really only two political parties that matter in elections. Yes, there are third parties like there's the Libertarian Party, there's the Green Party, but really, they don't matter. Now, it's just Democrats and Republicans. They're the only ones that matter. And there are serious institutional hurdles to overcome for third parties. You have one, partisanship, and how there is kind of a sense of loyalty that a lot of Americans feel towards their particular political parties, especially now. You also have the money hurdle and the institutional hurdle, where it's hard for third parties to gain access to the institutions and to fundraise on levels to match the big two. But in the 1890s, the Populist Party did really well and came really close to kind of breaking in and to become a serious and long-lasting third party. So the Populists formed in 1892, and this is really the Populists are a great example of what a true working class party looks like. So if you look at the membership, it's a pretty diverse coalition of people coming together effectively to try and fight back against a political and economic establishment that was, to put it a bit bluntly, screwing them over. So the Populist Party was made up of, you had farmers, you had industrial workers, you had labor unions, women's rights advocates, the temperance movement, and not only that, you had alliances amongst different races as well. You had white members, you had black members, you had men, you had women, you had immigrants involved. And there's a quote in Rourke that I think does a great job of summarizing why you saw such diverse membership within the Populist Party. And it was a guy who was basically saying that doesn't matter what color you are, if you're poor, you're getting screwed over. I'm paraphrasing, but basically, for about a decade, the collective lower class of the country realized that they were being oppressed and divided by a political and economic establishment that was trying to keep them divided to prevent them from effectively challenging the institutions of power. When they realized this, a lot of those superficial differences like racism or sexism were put aside temporarily, and that's the key word, temporarily, to form a lower class alliance to really pose a serious challenge to the institutions of power in the United States. And there are a lot of things to keep in mind about why the Populists were so effective, or not effective, but why the Populists were so popular and why they rose to the level they did in the time period they did. So first off, if you look at their policies, you can see they were advocating for some pretty radical changes to the United States. First off, the Populists were advocating for free silver, where they wanted to add silver into the currency, which would serve the purpose of increasing the money supply and making it easier for debtors to pay off their debts. They advocated land reform, where basically they wanted to eliminate speculation and absentee ownership, or at least restrict absentee ownership. But they wanted to eliminate speculation, where basically if you're not improving the land, if you don't live there, or if you're not improving the land or doing something meaningful with it, i.e. farming, or doing some useful economic activity on the land, then you don't need that land. That land's going to go to somebody that's actually going to put it to some good use. They advocated for the 8-hour workday. So you see here already, you have policies that were designed to appeal to both the urban poor and the rural poor. The populists advocated for government ownership of railroads and telegraphs, arguing that because the railroad and the telegraph were so important and so central for the economic well-being of such a big portion of the country, they could not be trusted to be run by private corporations motivated by profit. Then on a political level, the People's Party advocated for secret ballots. They advocated for referendums, which were effectively direct ballot initiatives put forth to the people, effectively a form of direct democracy. A good example of a more recent referendum, just from this past election cycle, Florida. There was a referendum that passed in Florida where Floridians approved a $15 minimum wage. That's a referendum. It was not a law that went through the legislature. It was just a thing put on the ballot saying, hey, what do you guys want to do? So this is an example of direct democracy. More common examples of referendums that you generally see would be referendums to try and legalize marijuana or decriminalize drugs. But again, you're starting to see ones recently relating to things like minimum wage. And I think there was one as well, or a push to try and reinstate voting rights for felons. I have to double check that. Populists also pushed for the direct election of senators. At this time, senators were not elected by the people of their state. They were chosen by the state legislatures. And the populists were arguing this was increasing corruption, and this was denying the people the voice that they should have. So they were pushing to get senators directly elected by the people, which, as we know now, would eventually succeed during the Progressive Era with the passage of the 17th Amendment that allowed for the direct election of senators. They also pushed for the recall of officials, where basically the recall, if there was an elected official that was commonly believed to be doing a bad job, and the majority of the people wanted to boot them out of office before their term expired, that they could hold a recall election, where basically people could vote, do you want to kick this guy out before his term is up? I have a funny story about a recall. Well, not funny, just a personal experience. So I'm from Toledo, and when I was in high school, I think it was middle school or high school, there was a mayor in Toledo, Cardi Finkbeiner, who there was a recall election for. He managed to stay in office, but there was a recall election in my hometown for the mayor that people thought was kind of crappy and really sucked. Anyway, the populists did really well for a third party. They elected a number of officials at the state and local levels. They even got a few people elected to Congress. And again, very shocking for a third party. In the presidential election of 1892, they actually won some states, which is crazy to think about, a third party actually winning a state. But a lot of this popularity for the populists came because of the Panic of 1893, which at the time was the worst economic depression the United States had ever seen. Again, it would not be surpassed until the Great Depression in the 1930s. But the Panic of 1893 was especially difficult and tough because the government actively chose to not really do anything about it. They believed that by getting involved in the economy, it would only make things worse. So the government chose to just kind of stay out of it. The populists, however, were really the only group of people saying, actually, no, we need to do something about this because this is bad. And with that, they were really, really popular, especially amongst the lower classes. they posed such a threat that in the election of 1896, the Democratic Party effectively co-opted the populists and brought them into the fold, which is generally what happens when third parties start to do well in the U.S. One of the major two parties will kind of absorb them, whichever one is closest to them ideologically. In this arrangement, in theory, it would work to the mutual benefit of both groups, because by merging with the Democrats, the populists would actually have a much bigger chance of getting people into office who would support what they want. While the Democrats, by kind of co-opting the populists and moving a bit more in this direction, more in this working class direction, it was helping the Democrats rebuild themselves after their party was just kind of obliterated during the Civil War, where they needed to effectively rebrand themselves and find a new identity. And with the Populist Party, with the co-option of the populist movement, the Democrats start to transition away from this party of the South and start to move towards this working class party. And this was helped as the Republicans more openly embraced the notion that they were the party of business and the upper class during the Gilded Age. The Democrats kind of saw an opportunity of, we could be the party of the lower class. Now, this transition would not be complete in the 1890s, but you start to see the groundwork for what would later be called the New Deal coalition that would put FDR into office for 4 terms in a row. So the Democratic Party is starting to get its act together and become relevant again, at least on a national level. The populists were also incentivized to join with the Democrats because the Democrats actually had a really a candidate who agreed with the populists on a lot of stuff, William Jennings Bryan, who is to date the youngest person to ever run for president. But William Jennings Bryan is a rather interesting figure because, again, he kind of represents this bridge between more radical demands and the political establishment. He wound up running for president for I don't know how many times. He ran for president a lot and lost every single time. You had some concern about this alliance forming between the Democrats and the populists, although this political cartoon is a bit misleading. It kind of gives the impression that the populists took over the Democrats and made the Democrats a lot more radical, when in actuality, after the election of 1896 and the loss of William Jennings Bryan to William McKinley, the opposite happened, where the Democrats actually kind of moderated the populists and moved them a bit more to the right. So for some, this was the fear. For some, this was the hope, but this did not really materialize. What's also really interesting on this period, and I promised I was going to talk about this before the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, but what's also interesting during this period is you start to see a lot more direct grassroots action from the public targeted towards the government. So here again is a picture of Coxey's army, this massive march on the Capitol by effectively this just giant mass of unemployed people, this giant mass of the made up of the 50% of the country that was unemployed during this time, the highest unemployment rate that the U.S. has ever seen, who were marching on the Capitol to try and demand the government do something to deal with the Panic of 1893. Yeah. While you had the Farmers Alliance going on in the rural parts of the country, within the industrial economy, you had you had a lot of labor unrest during the 1880s and the 1890s as well. It's come to be collectively referred to as the labor wars by a lot of historians. Or effectively, you just have a lot of labor activity trying to push for greater recognition of workers' rights and movements to address the inequality. So strikes were commonly held, protests were commonly held for things like the 8-hour workday, for raises to the minimum wage, for recognition of workers' rights to unionize and collectively bargain. I'm forgetting a big one. For arguments against to end child labor and stuff like that. There are a number of major strikes and actions undertaken during this period. I'm not actually going to go into a whole lot of them because your official bigger research project over the Gilded Age is going to be related to the labor wars, so I don't want to go into a whole lot of stuff. But you had a bunch of major strikes in industries like steel, mining, railroads, and what is the important takeaway from these movements is that most labor activities in this period failed because the government would basically get involved to back management and help them break the strikes and oppose labor. So, for example, with the Homestead strike, the National Guard was called out to break the strike. With the Pullman strike, the military was called in to put down the strike. However, the Cripple Creek miners' strike was a notable exception to the rule and was actually pretty successful for the strikers. And the main reason why was Colorado, the state in question, had a populist governor. And he refused to intervene on behalf of in this case, the mine owners. He intervened on behalf of the miners and the union. So what we see through the labor wars, some big takeaways from the labor wars, you see that the outcome of labor disputes depended a lot on whose side the government was going to take. Because, again, government power would determine who won a labor dispute. And 9 times out of 10, the government backed management, they backed the company, they backed the business owner. And what this kind of signals during this period is what we see is there's almost like a dispute over whose rights matter more, the business owner's property rights or the workers' rights to unionize and bargain collectively. And by and large, the general interpretation throughout this period was that property rights trump workers' rights, that the business owner's right to run his business how he wants is valued and protected more than workers' rights to form unions and bargain as a collective. So that's an important takeaway from the labor wars. Here you have some major figures with the labor wars. You have over here on the left, George Pullman, owner of the Pullman Car Company, who was involved in the Pullman strike. In the middle, you have Henry Clay Frick, who was actually Andrew Carnegie's foreman, who brought in Pinkerton guards to try and crush the Homestead strike. Although, if you've read Rourke, if you've read Brat and the Brescher excerpt, you'll know that the Pinkertons did not really have the success they thought they had. On the right, you have the Hoosier Eugene V. Debs, who is the leader of a railroad workers union, who was kind of Pullman's opponent in the Pullman strike. And Debs is a really interesting figure in American history. So Debs starts his career off as a labor activist, and when his defeat in the Pullman strike kind of inspires him, and kind of gets him to start looking at the American political and economic structure a bit differently. His takeaway was that the structure was inherently corrupt and biased and broken in favor of management and the business owners, and that the only true way to address the problem and fix it was to get rid of the system and start from scratch. So Debs is probably the most famous legitimate socialist in American history. Again, that term is thrown around a lot and applied to people and politicians that it does not apply to. But Debs is like an actual, or well, he's dead now, but Debs was an actual American socialist who did not believe in reform, believed in revolution. And he shows up a number of times. Meanwhile, while you've got all this working class and lower class resentment and unrest going on throughout the 1890s, in response to the inequalities of the Gilded Age that were exacerbated by the Panic of 1893, you've also got the age of American imperialism. So just because the U.S. had completed Manifest Destiny and was now stretching from sea to shining sea, that did not mean the U.S. was done expanding. This is when the U.S. starts to turn overseas for opportunities to expand, notably during the presidency of William McKinley. So, American imperialism did not begin with the government. It actually began with business. American corporations started expanding internationally. Notably, they started going into poorer countries to gain access to natural resources. And as they expanded, they used their political influence over the government to structure foreign policy, to become more interventionist, to protect their interests. Basically, the corporations viewed it as if they were going to invest money in this foreign country to try and extract natural resources, then they wanted the U.S. government to give them a guarantee that if stuff goes south and their investment would become threatened, then the U.S. government would intervene to protect said investment. Notably, like for let's say let's say an American company invested in Nicaragua, and all of a sudden you've got some political instability down there. You've got a political movement that wants to start taxing them more, or potentially nationalize their business or regulate them more. They would use the leverage of the U.S. government to go down there and pressure that foreign government to back off and let them do what they want, which gives rise to the term banana republics. But some good examples of American imperialism is Hawaii, actually. So Hawaii had been targeted and developed by sugar and fruit companies for years, because, again, it was a great place to grow sugar and some more exotic fruits like pineapples. And as the Hawaiian queen, Liliuokalani, started to pose a bit more of a threat to U.S. corporate interests, the sugar companies and the investors actually staged a coup in 1893 and overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy and began pressing the U.S. government to annex them directly so they wouldn't have to pay American tariffs, which was completed in 1898 when William McKinley annexed Hawaii as a territory. You also have the American expansion into Asia. So Asia was viewed as a pretty lucrative market at this time, especially China. China had a very large population. China also had a lot of exotic goods that you really couldn't get anywhere else. And there were a number of early American attempts to break into China, which, interestingly enough, the first such attempt was through missionary work. Starting in 1858, you had a number of American missionaries go into China to try and spread Christianity. They had pretty limited success. I think Rourke mentions they converted maybe about 100,000 Chinese to Christianity, when in reality there were like 400 million Chinese. So they really didn't have a lot of success. But they did tick off a number of Chinese, notably a group referred to as the Boxers, which was a group of Chinese who were opposed to foreign influence in China. And during the 1800s, the U.S. was not the only country messing around in China. This was also the age of the Opium Wars, when Great Britain effectively used its military might to force the Chinese to buy opium from the British. You also had the carving up of China into spheres of influence by not just the British, but also by the French, the Russians, the Germans, the Americans, and the Japanese tried to get in on it as well. So there was a lot of anti-foreign sentiment going on in China from groups like the Boxers, which culminated in the Boxer Rebellion from 1899 to 1900, where you had these Boxers rise up and target foreigners and Chinese Christians and Chinese who had ties to foreigners before they were subdued by European intervention. After the Boxer Rebellion, Europe takes a much more hardline approach with China, imposing a lot more restrictions on them and forcing China to give them a lot more direct control over their own spheres of influence. The U.S. responded to this by pressing for what's known as the open door policy, where the U.S. was trying to cut into Chinese markets despite lacking a well-defined sphere of influence, or at least a sphere of influence as big and developed as those of the major European powers. So as we near the end of the 19th century, the U.S. is trying to kind of muscle its way in to a seat at the big kid table with the big European powers like Great Britain and France. And it kind of works, at least to an extent. So here on the left, again, you have a representation of the Boxer Rebellion, or in this case, these would be European armies breaking the siege around Peking to free their trapped nationals there. On the right, that is Queen Liliuokalani, the last independent Hawaiian ruler of Hawaii. After her deposition or overthrow by American sugar and fruit companies, she actually wrote the song Aloha Oi, which is, you hear a lot related to a lot of just stuff pertaining to Hawaii. Although usually it's presented in a way that does not give it the tragic and really kind of outright depressing context that the song has. Hawaii's got a really interesting history. You start to see that U.S. foreign policy is changing. America's kind of grown up, and they want to be treated like a big boy. And to an extent, they actually play their hands right to make the European powers view them and treat them the way they want. A bit of foreshadowing here with a political cartoon showing President Theodore Roosevelt and what is referred to as big stick diplomacy, which we will talk about later. But what leads up to people like Roosevelt is a reinterpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. If you remember back to first semester, I think it was first quarter, well, end of first quarter, beginning of second quarter, the Monroe Doctrine was a foreign policy statement passed by, or basically handed down by President James Monroe that effectively warned European powers not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere, but let the Western Hemisphere kind of do its own thing, free from their intervention. In the 1890s, there's a reinterpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, where, yes, it says European powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere because this is an American sphere of influence. Central, South America, that's for the U.S. to play around in. Europe, you stay somewhere, you stay over in the East. This is our place. And throughout the 1890s, the U.S. did effectively cement the Western Hemisphere as an American sphere of influence, as American businesses effectively transformed most of Central America into what are termed banana republics, which are basically puppet governments ruled over by foreign corporations, in this case, American corporations, to serve their economic interests. And the term comes from the United Fruit Company effectively taking control of Central American countries to ensure they had access to foreign and exotic fruits, notably bananas. And that's where the term banana republic comes from. Okay, last slide. And this is really what launches the American Empire officially, and what gets Europe to start looking at the U.S. is like, oh, okay, you can do that now, alrighty. And that is the Spanish-American War. So by the late 1800s, most of the Western Hemisphere had already been decolonized. There were a few holdouts, though, notably Cuba. And in 1895, Cubans began revolting against Spanish rule. By this time, Spain had fallen hard from their previous period as world superpower in the 1500s and arguably 1600s. But the Spanish were still fighting the Cubans hard to ensure Cuba remained a Spanish colony. And there was a lot of pressure on the U.S. to intervene, with many arguing that the Cubans were being horribly mistreated, which they were, by the Spanish, and that the U.S., as the nearby world power, needed to intervene, invoking the Monroe Doctrine to effectively free Cuba. And in 1898, the U.S. does so and very quickly defeats Spain. It's not really even close. The U.S. Pretty easily defeats Spain, both in Cuba, but also in Spain's other Asian colony of the Philippines. The war was short. It was very popular and served to unify the country, stemming in part from the outgrowth of what's referred to as yellow journalism, which was effectively news coverage in major newspapers in New York, and kind of spread around the country, that sensationalized what was going on in Cuba, particularly after the explosion of the Maine in Havana Harbor. In the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. gains its first official American colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, from Spain. So following the Spanish-American War, the U.S. officially does have an overseas empire. They are officially an imperialist nation. Cuba, as you might expect, is rather annoyed and angry with this because the Cubans had been fighting for independence, and really now the only thing that had changed was that instead of being ruled by Spain, they were being ruled by the United States. The U.S. did wind up granting independence to Cuba fairly quickly after they accepted or after they approved an American-written constitution for them and improved what's referred to as the Platt Amendment, where Cuba is technically independent, but the United States could intervene to protect Cuban independence, or rather, could serve as a police force on Cuba. They gained control of Cuba's debt, and they established a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which is still an American naval base today, which is, again, rather interesting. So this was a rather interesting time period to look at. There's a lot that happens. I mean, this video is like 45 minutes long, so clearly there's a lot that happened. If you have questions over any of this stuff, honestly, I'd say email me because I'm not going to see you for like another week and a half. So yeah, email, and we can do something through either email or Zoom or something like that to try and cover this. So we're kind of moving into the progressive era and our next unit. So don't forget to prepare and be ready for the Gilded Age test, which will unlock tomorrow. And be on the lookout for information regarding your research project and your first expository paper of the semester. So if you've got any questions, let me know. Hope iStep goes well for you, and I will see you later.